What is going on, y'all? It is the Caveman back at it again with another video. I am back to rank another positional group this week. We already did the quarterbacks, we did the wide receivers, now we're doing the running backs. I did subconsciously understand that it was going to get more and more difficult to rank these positional groups as I went through them, but I guess I didn't actually realize it until I started to do it. The quarterbacks were hard, the wide receivers were harder, the running backs were even harder than that. I'm imagining based on how it's going so far, it's not going to get much easier for me. But before we get into it, you guys know the drill around here. Mott's applesauce, if you're ever hungry, thirsty, whatever it might be, Mott's applesauce will satisfy whatever satisfying you need to satisfy with the Caveman guarantee. I promise it will never fail you. Alright, so quick rundown. If you've been watching the series for the last couple weeks, you probably know how this works, but if you're new to it, this is how I like to do things. So I've been going through and ranking the top 32 players by positional group. Today I'm obviously doing the running backs, and I've been doing this in a two-part video series. Today will be part 1, where I rank the top 32 through 11 running backs, and then tomorrow will be where I rank the top 10 running backs. Not only do I rank these players 1 through 32 numerically, I also combine a numeric ranking list with a tier list. So you're going to see the players on screen and they're going to be color coded. Color key that I'm throwing on screen right now will let you know what tier that these players are in based on the color coding they receive. Also, for some context, when I rank these players 1 through 32, I am basing it on if I was going for a Super Bowl run next season, who would I want on my team, if that makes sense. So with all of that being said, let's hop right into it. Starting with my average running back tier, this is only going to be 32 through 30. And here we have Antonio Gibson, James Robinson, and Chase Edmonds. Antonio Gibson's a player that a lot of people had high hopes for going into 2021, but between injury and mismanagement, he really wasn't able to reach his full potential. He is a former wide receiver, and if Ron Rivera stopped being so stubborn and used him in the receiving game more often, I think his value is driven up this list. But I mean, as far as his rushing goes, he's not the most efficient, so I think he's probably at the top of the average tier. James Robinson's another guy that's just not in a great situation. He doesn't have much receiving upside. Now with Travis Etienne returning, I expect James Robinson to kind of evaporate into a second running back on that roster. And for Chase Edmonds, I do think if he received more volume, he could be one of the better dual threat running backs in the NFL. But when it comes to just pure rushing, he is not one of the most efficient. He does average like 5.1 yards per carry, but he also averages like 3.1 yards before contact and only like 1.7 yards after contact. So it's like the guy does not do good when he actually has to run through some bodies. All right, so that was my average running back tier. Let's move on to the biggest tier that I have on this entire list, being the above average running back tier. This is going to cover 18 through 29. At 29, we have first-year running back Michael Carter for the New York Jets. He actually was one of the more efficient running backs in the NFL last year. He didn't get a tremendous amount of volume. His 2.3 yards after contact and his 4.3 yards per attempt did make him a relatively solid first-year guy. I'm not sure how many carries he's going to get going into his second year now that Breece Hall's in that backfield. For what he had to offer in year 1, I do think he could be considered an above-average running back. Moving on to 28, we had Cordero Patterson. Patterson is not one of the more efficient runners, but his receiving upside is just far too high to not consider him an above-average running back, if you will. Miles Sanders and James Conner. I mean, I'm not a big fan of James Conner whatsoever. I know he had the most rushing touchdowns this season. He didn't average the most yards per attempt, but this dude did not have much room to run before getting shellacked. He had 1.6 yards before contact, 2.1 yards after contact, 19 broken tackles. Miles Sanders, similar to Chase Edmonds, had a lot of yards per attempt as well. I think it was like 5 yards per attempt or something for Miles Sanders, but he also had one of the highest yards before contact per attempt. So, I mean, Miles Sanders, he was slightly more efficient than Chase Edmonds, but just because his yards per attempt were so high doesn't mean he's warranting a higher spot than this. A.J. Dillon and Devin Singletary are an interesting pair here. They're pretty different running backs, to be quite honest. Devin Singletary is a lot more elusive. This Quadzilla is just probably going to run you over, and Quadzilla had a pretty solid year, and I do think he's a lot closer to taking Aaron Jones' job than people like to admit. But I'm a big fan of both of these guys, and I do think they fall under the same umbrella of if they were featured more often, then they definitely would be producing at a more efficient, higher level. Moving on to Melvin Gordon and Josh Jacobs, I do think Josh Jacobs is the better running back for a number of reasons. I think Melvin Gordon's on the downhill slope of his career, but he still broke 20 tackles this year, was relatively efficient in the process. Josh Jacobs is, of course, the younger running back, but the main reason why I took him over Melvin Gordon was because he offered a dimension which we really haven't seen from Josh Jacobs in the past, and that was the ability to receive out of the backfield. And as his career goes on, he seems to be getting more and more involved in the passing game. For the last 4 guys in my above average tier, these are 4 players that have talent that is completely undoubtable. It's just that they cannot stay on the field for their lives. Rashad Penny missed a majority of 2021, but when he returned, he was one of the most efficient, and he looked like one of the best running backs in the NFL. That dude looked quick, he looked strong, he was breaking tackles, he led the league in yards after contact after he did return. Granted, his sample size was not the largest, but you can just go watch some of Rashad Penny's highlights at the end of last year. The dude had some pop. But before I see it on a more consistent basis, I don't think he deserves to be any higher higher, and I see people overrating him tremendously just because of that final stretch he had last season. I gotta see it a lot more before I go putting him in the top 15, top 16. Saquon Barkley, I mean, the poor guy just can't stay healthy. He hasn't been very efficient. When he's been on the field, his offensive line's been miserable. He's been one of the only weapons, so I mean, people are just so focused on him. He really just has not caught a break. Although this is probably Barkley's last chance to really show me whether or not he's still got it. They obviously hired Brian Dable to be their head coach. He's one of the most creative offensive minds in football, so hopefully that'll help him. He's just got to stay on the field. He's got to produce. He's got to be efficient. He's got to be effective. If he can't do it this year, then I'm just going to be writing him off from here on out. For Zeke and Kareem Hunt, these are two players that look tremendous at the start of the season, but injuries pretty much derailed 2021 for both of them. Kareem Hunt missed the final 9 games, and Zeke just did not look the same after he suffered what I think was a knee injury. But they both looked undoubtedly solid at the start of 2021. I mean, we all thought Zeke was returning to his form back in 2016, 2017 at the start of this year. Like, that's how good he looked. For Kareem Hunt, I know he might be a little high on this list for some people, but this guy is still one of the most talented running backs in the NFL. If he was still featured like he was back in Kansas City, he'd be a top 12, top 10 running back easy. All right, so that wraps up the above average tier. We're going to move into the great tier, which is going to be the final tier in part 1 of this video. This is going to cover 17 through 11. My God, I mean, it's just so hard to rank these guys, let me tell you. Damian Harris at 17, he had like 15 touchdowns this year. He's got next to no receiving upside whatsoever, so that's why he's at the tail end of the great tier. But when it comes to his rushing ability, he's still one of the better guys in the NFL. Tony Pollard is a guy that I think people are starting to slightly overrate, but I think it's only a matter of time before he takes over the starting role in Dallas. I think Zeke only has it because they pay him so much money. But until Pollard's featured, I can't have him over these other guys. Poor David Montgomery, man. He can be so much higher, but dear God, he's a part of the Chicago Bears. Awful coaching staff, awful offensive line, awful front office. He slowed down in 2021 in comparison to 2020 because of the lack of blocking he received, but I do think he still could be one of the better talents if he just got some more help. 14, we got rookie Elijah Mitchell, who took the league by storm. Nobody really expected him to pop off the way he did. Granted, he's got guys like Kyle Juszczyk, Trent Williams, George Kittle blocking for him. That doesn't take away from how great of a year Elijah Mitchell had. I mean, there were other running backs in that backfield that played for him when he went down because he only played in 11 games, folks. Those other backs were not nearly as efficient. Elijah Mitchell was on a 1,500-yard pace this season had he not missed 6 games. We would have finished with between 8 to 10 touchdowns. The guy was one of the most productive running backs in the NFL, and just because he's behind one of the best lines in the league does not take away from what he did this year. For 11 through 13, one of these guys is not like the others. You're probably seeing Leonard Fournette at 11, and your eyes are probably popping out of your skull. Look, I have something for Leonard Fournette. I don't know what it is. I love the guy. I don't know why. I just really like him, all right? And I can't get over it. But I have good reason for it, and I promise. Leonard Fournette did not have the most volume because he split carries for the first half of the year with Ronald Jones. But once he pushed Ronald Jones out of the picture, he showed why he still was one of the most talented running backs in the NFL. He had 8 touchdowns as well, so in combination with only playing 14 games and splitting carries for the first half of the season, and had he played the entire season, he would have had about 1,500 yards from scrimmage, which would have been his second in his career. I mean, 69 receptions, 450 yards, and 2 touchdowns for a guy like Leonard Fournette who runs with so much power, so much strength. I mean, that is an impressive stat line for a guy like that. And then for Aaron Jones and DeAndre Swift, I do think Aaron Jones is a slightly better version than DeAndre Swift. I think he's more efficient in the run game. But when it comes to receiving, both DeAndre Swift and Aaron Jones are pretty much 2 of the best in the NFL. They're both so elusive. They're both so quick. I mean, they both have that big playability. You never know when they're going to break one off. The biggest thing holding DeAndre Swift back from being like a top 10 running back is just his inefficiency when running the ball. Sometimes he just misses some obvious holes. He was behind one of the better offensive lines in football with the Detroit Lions. But at the same time, if he's able to become just a slightly more efficient rusher, I mean, he's easily a top 10 running back in the NFL right now. So yeah, that will wrap up the great tier, and that will pretty much wrap up the video. I'll throw the entire top 32 through 11 running backs on screen right here. Like I said, tomorrow is going to be part 2, the top 10 running backs in the NFL, and I hope to see you there. But as always, if you enjoyed this one, please like, subscribe, do all the fun stuff. If you want to hit the bell to be notified when I upload, I'd appreciate that. You want to go over to Twitter, follow me over there, I'd appreciate that as well. I have a TikTok down in my description that I think you should check out, and I hope to see you in the next one. Peace.